It is said that a company that stops disrupting itself is just waiting to get disrupted. And in the tech world, we've seen this over and over again. Companies who became complacent and then were overtaken. So the key idea is that if you want to stay on top, you should keep disrupting yourself. And that is what Apple is doing. In end 2020, Apple released the M1 chip, disrupting its previous line of Intel products, and with it came this revolutionary new level of computing power and vertical integration. Much like we'd seen in the A series chips, Apple M1 often did more for less, crushing its competition. At the time, many of us thought that M1 would be peak Apple for quite a while. After all, the computing power brought about by M1 was often superfluous and kind of an overkill. It was a nice to have, but not exactly a necessity. Now, Apple obviously thought M1 was lacking because they soon followed up with M1 Pro and M1 Max, and performance was mind-blowing. If there was really anything to complain about classic M1, it would have been the usual classic media gripes. Things about the graphics, faster render time, smoother real-time rendering, things like that. And so Apple just comes in with the Pro and Max variations and pretty much solves all these problems, disrupting themselves once again in less than a year's span of time. Now, disruption is an interesting idea because simply creating a new product doesn't mean it's happening. Disruption happens when the advent of a novel product or creation comes along and affects its legacy counterparts, what's going on and what exists right now, forcing a new level or type of feature parity. Basically, what exists right now, the competition, the landscape of the market right now, has to evolve and have certain features and benefits in order to even be considered valid competition in comparison with this new product. Think about when the iPhone first came out in 2007. People cared more about apps and software now, and the landscape was changing. Companies like Nokia, who couldn't adapt and thought that people still wanted hardware-focused feature phones, eventually became obsolete simply because they didn't have that one factor, that one feature, to be considered a real competitor to the iPhone. So now the question is twofold. First, is Apple really disrupting itself, or is this some sort of master plan that no one just gets, including me? And second, say it is really Apple doing some crazy, fast-paced self-disruption. What is driving them? What is their motivating factor? Now here's my take on it. First off, Apple is disrupting themselves, and they're doing so at an unusually fast pace. Now, most companies, if they had an innovation like M1, they would pretty much sit on it for quite a while, trying to replace their whole lineup with a classic M1 chip, try to sell as much as possible, make all their profits, milk the hell out of this new chip before releasing a new variation. And I guess that's what a normal company does. Apple's not a normal company. They're one of the best companies with some of the best corporate culture and just corporate vision, so I guess there's that. But most companies would do that. Right? And Apple's not having any of that at all. In fact, they've released not one, not two, but 3 new variations, all higher end than the classic M1 if we include the latest M1 Ultra that's in the Mac Studio. Now, one of the cool psychological impacts that Apple has made on the market is this thing called the center stage effect, or bias towards the center. With now 4 coming close to 5 M1 chips, if we assume that the new rumored M1 Extreme will come out, I'm pretty excited for that. If we assume that there's about, say, 4 or 5 chips in this lineup, and most people don't really get into the nitty-gritty of, cores, processors, different graphics, and all the numbers, then what happens is this thing called a bias towards the center, where people just start going towards what seems like the safest choice. It's not the cheapest product, it's not the cheapest chip, and it's also not the most extreme one because a lot of people think that they don't need the absolute best. And so you get this really, really interesting occurrence where the baseline has basically became, an M1 Pro or maybe an M1 Max. And that definitely signifies disruption because of the upward shift in this baseline, which used to be a M1 chip. And keep in mind, M1 chip is not old at all. It's end 2020 and it's still a fantastic chip, but just the psychological effect of thinking that, a Pro or Max would be considered the default right now is pretty amazing. So now what about the second question? Why is Apple in such a rush, in such a hurry, to basically release all these M1 chips? Now, in order for them to do this, they basically have to think that this less than 2-year time span back-to-back release of all the M1 variations is better than the alternative, which could have been a nice 3 to 4 year smooth sailing release, where everything is a little bit more spaced out, it's staggered, and they would be able to milk each chip a lot more for a longer time. That means that despite the fact that all these chip releases eat and so-called cannibalize the baseline M1 sales, they still think that a speedy launch of every single M1 variation out there is better than not doing so. So I'm gonna take an educated but rather wild guess, so this may completely be out of left field, but I think one of Apple's greatest motivations for releasing all these chips and just products in general at such a fast pace right now is due to their worry about the potential worsening of the global chip shortage. And it's not just that. Take a look at it. The macroeconomic landscape isn't looking good. Supply chains are bogged down. Commodity prices are up, with all that's going on right now. Metal prices are up. Silicon is hard to get their hands on. Even if they do, they need a place to refine it and, do the whole fabrication process. Everything just doesn't seem to be letting up, and it doesn't look like things will get any better in the near future. Apple is sitting on a ton of cash and cash equivalents for all their crazy capital expenditure needs. And in times like this, in pretty much a crisis, is exactly when they need to double down, create new products, open manufacturing plants for chips, and focus on more innovation. Not doing so would result in a short-term loss of sales, which probably already occurred either way, and perhaps even long-term failure. If I were to take a guess, I would say Apple already brought ahead quite a few releases of different products. Unfortunately, the remnants of the pandemic, the residual effects on the greater economy, and the current war, which is really, really unfortunate, has caused a much greater shock to Apple than they probably thought. But that's just conjecture. It would explain, however, why the iPhone 14 may not be getting the A16 chip. That's just speculation right now. It's also why we haven't heard much about the M2 products, which was supposedly coming this year in 2022. And it would also explain why certain product releases and redesigns like the new MacBook Airs, which were apparently supposed to have a completely new design and fresh look, haven't really been talked about, rumored, or leaked that much yet. I'm sure they're in the works, and either way it's going to be interesting because the giant is now awake, or it's awake again. It used to be, fell into a little bit of a slumber, now it's back. They're working hard, you can tell, and I think from here on out, things are going to be really, really interesting. I am personally keeping a lookout for these new products that we'll be releasing, and I might have to make a little bit of a jump, but we'll see. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something and found the ideas discussed in this video really, really interesting. It's really packed with a lot of cool concepts and just general observations and trends. So if you learned something, do give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you like it. It really helps a lot. The algorithm appreciates it and I appreciate you. That is it, and I'll catch all of you in the next one. Peace.